My name is Antonia Darder. I'm the Levy Presidential Endowed Chair here at Loyola Marymount University. I'm a Freudian scholar, internationally recognized, but more importantly, I'm an activist scholar, and beyond being a scholar and an activist, I'm also a poet and an artist, a visual artist. For me, the art is also important. It's as important as the scholarly work I do because it has a lot to do with how I express myself in the world, but also how I struggle both inside myself and outside myself to be the best person I can in order to connect with a larger vision of life. And I was born in Puerto Rico, and at the age of 3 ended up here in the United States, and ended up actually growing up in East Los Angeles. So my life is a lot of what informs my work, my studies, my research, my teaching, in that I grew up as a very, very poor child, dealing with all the issues that our kids have to deal with in terms of poverty, racism, not being understood well by our teachers and things of that sort. And actually, those difficult times that I went through had so much to do with what helped me to be a really good scholar, I think, in the sense that all of my scholarship is very much informed by lived experiences. You know, at this point in my life, I'm considered an international recognized Freudian scholar, and that's because Paulo Freire's work has been absolutely instrumental to all of my research and to my own formation as an activist and as an educator. Part of what that means, of course, is that I've been in too many different parts of the world to talk about Freire's work and to talk about issues of biculturalism and to talk about the ways in which social class and racism impact our children and communities here in the United States. And that for me is, has been incredibly gratifying because what it's taught me is the manner in which oppression is anywhere you go. I've written 11 books. I have a new book coming out very soon on Freudian education, which I'm very excited about. It's a small book, so what I like about it is that it'll be more accessible to people. It'll be easier to read. It won't be so long, and I think that that's important. But it also introduces Freire from the standpoint of a person who's been oppressed. And what does it mean to engage the pedagogy of the oppressed as a person who's been oppressed and who has struggled in the community and in academia and education to try to bring greater educational justice for our communities and our children. So for me, that's it's an act of love, and it, in a sense, gives me another opportunity to reach out to what I hope is a whole set of new folks, of young students and young scholars who are beginning to discover Freire's work again. I've worked on films. I've done a radio show called Liberación that I did with students. The documentary I did won second place at a women's film festival. The radio show was public radio. It was a wonderful opportunity to work with my graduate students and the community. And so we did shows on issues that were important, on environmental justice, on issues of racism, on the struggles that students deal with in colleges and universities. So it was a real opportunity to kind of look at what was happening in the community of Champaign, where I was doing that when I was a professor in the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I was living in the small community. And so everywhere I go, in terms of my activism, everywhere I go, I always look for ways in which I can link my teaching and my research to what's happening out in the community. And the reason for that is because I think that education is important, but if education doesn't link us to what is happening out in communities, then what good does it do us? And in what ways does education help us to create a better world? So for me, it's so much about that issue and all of my accomplishments in terms of, the books that I've written, the articles I've written, all the opportunities I've had to go out and speak in the world. All of those things for me are about being part of a larger movement, a social movement for justice, and a movement that works for women's rights, for immigrant rights, for the rights of all human beings to be able to truly be. So I think for me, that's why we're activists. We're activists because we love our communities, we love the world, we love life. And so for me, all that we do should be about that love for life. You know, one of the interesting things is that even though I've accomplished all those things, probably the greatest accomplishment in my life has been that I have survived. And I say that not in any kind of, sentimental way. I say that really from a very political and very strong sense as a woman to have survived. I grew up in just incredible poverty. My mother was schizophrenic, and so she had a lot of issues. I mean, she really suffered, and there weren't the opportunities, or there weren't the kind of mental health interventions that there are now. As a child, and being the oldest child of Carmen Rodriguez, Carmen Aguilar Rodriguez, it wasn't an easy process, because a lot of responsibility was put upon me. So in a lot of ways, I didn't even get to be a child a whole lot. I had a lot of responsibility for the house, for my sister, very, very young. And my mother was very, physically abusive, verbally abusive, emotionally abusive. She had struggles with relationships. I ended up being sexually abused for a number of years as a young child, and went through tremendous terror and fear around, how I was going to survive all of that. What had ended up happening was that as soon as I could, leave my house, I left my house. So at 16, I got married, and by the time I was 20, I had 3 children already. The interesting thing about being a poor Latina woman at that time, in those conditions, were that usually people, and maybe even today, I think there's this tendency to believe that because you're young and you have kids, that your life is over, and that you're never going to become anything. And what I know is, no matter how hard my childhood was, and having my children didn't keep me from becoming the person that I am today. On the contrary, what I would say, I don't want anybody to be abused, and I don't want anybody to be beaten or brutalized in any way. However, if for whatever reason in life that happens to be our experience, what I understand from everything I've gone through is that it doesn't have to define us, that it doesn't have to determine what our life is, that part of what we have to find in ourselves is this tremendous strength in ourselves and in our relationships with other people, so that we can find a way to really tap into our humanity, so that our humanity becomes the force that moves us forward. I think that why I do poetry, and why I'm a community activist, and why it was so important for me to fight for justice, had a lot to do, I know, with what I went through as a child. Sometimes when you have to overcome very, very difficult conditions in your life, at least for me, in my life, what it did is it actually made me more sensitive and more loving and more caring about wanting to reach out in order to deal with the suffering out in the world, to work so that other people didn't have to go through the same levels of suffering. And so I think that there's a way in which we have the power, all of us. Sometimes people don't tell us, and sometimes people don't treat us in that way, but that we all have the power to take our lives and turn them around through an incredible hopefulness and a willingness not to let anybody take away from us our incredible capacity to love ourselves, to love each other, and to love the world. So for me, what resilience means is really about the capacity to tap into the deepest spiritual sense of ourself, our ability to love, our intellect, the power of our body, our passion, toda la fuerza, all the force that we have, nuestro corazón, our heart, and to bring that to the world and allow ourselves to come out and to be with others and continue to struggle in our life. We will always struggle, I think, because this is not an easy world. You know, sometimes we see these Disney films and they make it seem like it's such an easy world. It's not an easy world. It's a hard world, especially for those of us that grow up poor, that grow up without a lot of opportunities, those of us that have to deal with racism, with sexism, you know, for those who have to deal with homophobia. I mean, there's all these forces that can bring us down. And yet what I understand is that through the power of community and the power of love and the power of loving ourselves and each other is how we find the resilience to continue moving forward. And the reason I say that is because it is through that that we find our dreams. And I really believe that so many times we have so many dreams inside of ourselves, things that we feel like we really want to do, or things that we hope to be able to do, but yet sometimes if we tell them to somebody, instead of them saying like, yeah, great, you know, do that, sometimes people will bring us down in our dreams. So I know that part of resilience is also being able to identify the people who appreciate you just the way you are, and who also appreciate your right and your capacity to dream, and that are there to be able to extend to you a sense of warmth and love and understanding. And I know that sometimes there are moments when we feel like we don't have those people in our life, but we have to keep giving. What I found that through my willingness to love and to bring the best of myself to others, that eventually people step up and people return that. And sometimes it may seem like that's not the way it is. Sometimes even Hollywood makes it seem like that's not the way it is. But it has to do with our willingness to always be there for ourselves. And through being there for ourselves, we are there for others. It's a powerful process, and it's difficult to talk about in just a few minutes, but I think that all of the things I do, whether they are my intellectual work as a scholar, my activist work, which is my political work out in communities, or my artistic work that has to do with the expression of the deepest, most sacred part of myself, as well as my spiritual sense of loving and being in the world. I think all of those come together in the capacity then to be resilient, and that no matter what happens, I know that somehow I'm never alone, and I reach out to all those around me to give me strength to move forward.